Well, Cybertonica, we kind of came at this very early, about 3-4 years ago. We started to decide that fraud, identity, and authentication were going to merge in about 5 years. So we built a platform that merges those data streams together, including the behavioral biometrics on the client side, because we don't feel that phones or devices of that kind are a trusted environment. So we've been working on that for some time. Our first products are coming out to market. I think Ollie and the guys at Nok Nok and Trusona have kind of hit it on the head in the sense that how can we do this so that satisfies somebody like Steve and other specialists, Boku, without interfering with the customer at all. We have, as they say, we have the technology. So we're working on making this a completely seamless experience with several levels that cover both the SCA inherents, but also in the future, different types of identity and onboarding authentication, all in one place. So I think that's the essence of what we've seen, is that there's a convergence coming and that the industry needs to be ready. And Paul, I know that you have a very big role to play with the regulator, and what we heard from UK Finance is encouraging, but I always feel after 15 years working in and out of this area that the regulator is just one generation behind on technology. And that the things we were hearing about the USA, quite behind the ball on GDPR and other things, things I've observed in the boardroom of WeChat's payment business, make me think that we've got to move quicker to that status I was talking about, where the three come together.
I agree. Ed, we'll go to you next, and then I'll glad to see Derek's back on.
I think it's quite an exciting space. And there's a lot of different ways to sort of provide a viable solution. The problem is a lot of the time we're getting lost in satisfying a technical legislation and not blocking the original objective of this, which is blocking fraud. And I think if people were given the opportunity to rewrite the legislation now, the ways that fraud can be prevented have already moved on so much that we can block it out. And now we're trying to retrospectively say, how do we tick 2 boxes out of 3? And that's where the challenge is. So from my personal point of view, I work for a company called Signifyd. We do work with merchants. We do an incredibly good job of blocking fraud at the merchant level. And the amount of data we see and the amount of, sorry, Stephen, keystrokes and typing dynamics that we see at the merchant level, you know, we really believe you can tick the compliance box at that end as well.
Derek, over to you.
So yeah, Derek Dempsey from Empyrric. It's an independent consultancy. We're focused on the use of AI, machine learning and analytics in financial crime and compliance space. I'll sort of get to the point around SCA. So, I mean, I pick up Ed's point, which is basically the purpose of the legislation. The SCA legislation is we want to have strong customer authentication to prevent fraud. So it wants to be strong. My objection to keystroke, well, my problems with keystroke dynamics, and that's what we mean when we're talking about behavioral biometrics here. We're not talking about behavioral profiling. We're talking about the keystroke dynamics element of that. That is the behavioral biometrics piece of this. I don't believe it's strong enough. I don't think there are any measures anywhere. I've done a lot of research to try to find any metrics, any reliable, robust metrics on just how accurate this is going to be. So when you have somebody, and this was raised in the last call, they're saying, well, what's going to be the sort of MO for this? Well, maybe it's somebody sends out an OTP, you get 6 digits, and you tap them into your phone, or you tap them into your laptop. And we're told that the vendors are telling us that's going to be enough, that's sufficient to identify that person once they've registered. So I am deeply skeptical that will be the case. However, I'm happy to be proved wrong if that is in fact not the case. Very happy to prove wrong, but nobody is posting any reliable metrics about the robustness of this approach. And so, you know, until that happens, I think we have to be seriously skeptical about whether this is going to provide a sufficient level. And we have some other there are some significant sort of previous cases. I mean, voice, for example, they've been trying to make voice work for like 20 years. So these are, it is not, it's easy to say, yes, there's a signature. That's really quite an easy thing. Of course, there is some sort of a signature, but it has to be really strong. Otherwise, people are going to be blocked from making payments. They're going to be tapping in the wrong way, and they'll say, no, that's not right. And then they'll get angry. They'll tap it in an even more different way. I think that will be sort of rampant, and I also, or potentially is so. And I also think that in order to make the customer experience easy, there's a real potential that it'll just open the door for fraudsters, and we end up with an SCA that's actually weaker than just regular authentication. So I think there are real questions that have to be answered by the vendors. Just how accurate is this? Just how much testing has gone on? How robust is it? What sort of level of probability? Because the EBA opinion says, and I've challenged the EBA on this, but they've said, well, it says very low probability. Now, I've seen studies on keystroke dynamics, recent studies, and they're varied. They're in small data sets run by universities, so they're likely to be better than they will see in the general population. And I've seen error rates over 20%. In fact, 2 of the 5 I looked at had error rates over 20%. So that means one in 5 times, people are going to get blocked out of this if that's all that's being used.
One of the reasons I wanted to raise this issue here, and it's going to be an ongoing part of our Vendorcom identity and authentication forums for as long as it takes, is that for anybody that was on the UK Finance webinar a few weeks ago, they basically explained the minimum viable product as being a keystroke analysis of the one-time passcode that was being sent to them by the bank. Now, I just cannot make that compute in any form of identifier, and nothing around that is going to define inherence. And so we need to make sure that if the issuers are going to have to prove to the FCA that they've got a compliant solution, that the FCA understands what a compliant solution even is in the first place. So Joshua, I'm going to bring you in here to just get a response to what Derek's saying.
Yeah, I just want to share our experience. So we agree with what Derek was saying, actually, and we think the keystroke definition that you guys are talking about and the UK regulator has defined is, I mean, we have regulators on this call. I don't want to be bad-mouthing them, but it's not sufficient. Let's put it that way. We look at about 800 data points. We use gyro. We use all of the elements that make us aware that the device being used is being used by the person who uses it. And our demo shows 2 people trying to make the same payment from the same phone in the same time frame, sort of with a login session rationale that's logical to most rule sets. And the second person, who is not the original person, cannot make that payment. At the same time, what we're doing is we're going to be using the open banking, and we're going to be using the payment data history of that device and that hashed identity to augment the recognition factor. So it's not going to be a ticked box, as you will. It's going to be a comprehensive, what we call mosaic score of that entity. So it's a user entity user entity behavior analytics piece. Testing. So we've done up to 2,500,000 interface devices. So that would be the ATMs, such as the ones that Ollie and the team worked with for Bank of America. ATMs, mobile phone screens, internal, very interestingly, we did with a bank an internal test using mouse pads, and we had error rates below 5%. So, and we had no false positives, statistically speaking. So this has been done obviously on a test bed, and we're rolling out the products in the next couple months. We'll be on the UK Finance Vendors event next week to share about the product. But I think if we can do it with 35 people and a few $1 million, there's got to be a way of improving it. And I'm before Stephen and Derek jump in, I'll say at the time that we couldn't measure longitude in Britain, it was enough to put up a single prize. It took some years, but that was before we could communicate with the speed we're doing now. Yeah, so
right.
We're kind of after that. We're after the longitude prize.
Interesting, interesting point. So, Steve, who's going to be the Harrison that brings the pocket watch to show us a longitude of this whole?
Question? I have nothing against behavioural. I think it has its place. It's part of the mix of identification. It's a good tool, fraud tool. But when it comes to authentication, I think Derek has hit the nail on the head. It becomes an issue. How do you build up history of a new user and their payment history when they're so frequently? And that's how fraudsters operate. They're in and out, and they don't hang around. And so in order for behavioral to get the analytics, and let's separate behavioral from biometrics, because it is no way a biometric. A biometric is a physical representation of a person, and it is not, and it is an analysis of their behavioral, and so is voice. So if you can't, why it's got lumped into this behavioral category as an authentication method is beyond me sometimes. I mean, there are false acceptance rates with regard to behavioral, because I could be typing differently in the morning or I can in the afternoon, and I only need 2 sessions in order to create fraud.
We are already down in a very detailed technical discussion of behavioral biometrics, and I would like to shift our focus in 2 dimensions back. First, from the second to the first factor, because I think the real problem is there, right? And second, from the security to the usability issue, right? So starting with SMS OTP, and that's what I heard consistently throughout the day, right? Is it starts with the first factor SMS OTP. This is a wrong approach, right? We have 15% card abandonment rate. This is not the way how card networks with 3D Secure can compete with Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, and Google Pay. They will continue to lose market share. This is not the right way to go. Let's focus first on something which is more usable than the SMS OTP in the first place, right? Back to the proposal, right? And yes, let's introduce myself, Rolf Lindemann from Nok Nok Labs, right? We got the whole FIDO and web authentication stuff going, and that was for a reason some time ago, right? Because when we looked at the authentication in the internet, figured that it is fundamentally broken, right? We are using weak factors and we are adding band-aids, right, to augment lack of security of those weak factors, but we can never make them more convenient.
I'm happy to be the lightning rod for the people who are nervous about behavioral. I know that we all want to be as valuable as Twilio, so we all want to be the standard for the next OTP replacement. But the fact is, it's got to be about the customer in the end. And by the way, it's got to be about inclusivity. So there are hundreds of millions of people who have no way of scanning a QR code, have no way of receiving an OTP in the country they are in, and have no way, therefore, of selling or buying across borders. So that's one of the things that we need to aspire to. And nobody on our side has ever pretended that behavioral, as good as we have been able to make it, is going to be a substitute. We think that the whole SCA argument around making behavioral, or keystrokes as it seems to have turned out to be, a deterministic factor, as Ollie was saying, is a mistake. We think that there's an elevation element, an escalation element that's got to be there. If you look at our icon here, right, what you see is a person in the middle who's also a keyhole, and then the different types of data around them. And when they're going to be requested for that token of more personal biometrics, such as a fingerprint or a face scan or whatever is their preferred higher level biometric authentication, that will also be offered by the same application that we're developing.
Stephen Fowler, I'm going to bring you in on this point, because clearly you guys have got an approach to this as well.
Yeah, so I've been listening, nodding every now and then to a lot of things that are being said. I look at it very much from I look at the other side of the coin from the merchant perspective, so the actual retailer or someone like that. There was a study, I think Forta did recently, where 10% of transactions are being declined at the moment through 3DS. So that's 10% of sales, and they've got, Forta, for example, I'm sure Signifyd have got the same. They've got a solution which enables, the ability to increase those sales by doing the exemptions and so on. And if I'm a merchant and I'm seeing, all this potential insecurity that's out there, potential loss of sales, I'm always going to look for what's the best journey for my customer and what's the best journey for me as a business. And that's not going to be going through a 3DS flow. That's going to be looking at the transaction risk analysis side, finds an acquirer and a PSB who is within the parameters to be able to offer that to me and has that facility. So, there's a lot of all this talk that we're having with the banks, etc. And we saw the slide there before that Al went through on the TRA. 5 of the top 6 issuing banks are saying they'll offer TRA. 15 of the next tier 2, tier 3s are offering exemptions. That's because they don't want the liability shift. So they're passing it back on to the PSPs, the merchants, saying, well, if you can provide, the merchants and the PSPs, they know more about the actual customer than what the actual bank does. And I think it was just mentioned, I think it was Ed or Ollie before mentioned that, there's so much detail that can be captured, which doesn't get captured in a 3DS flow.
I actually don't agree with you when you say that the bank doesn't have as much information as the customer, as the merchant. I think what happens is they both have different sets of quite significant amounts of information. And so they both have, quite seriously, but so they can both do their own forms of behavioral profiling, for example, but it's going to be different.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because that's one of the things we've explored is how we integrate just at the issuer or the banking side, the collaboration between our data analytics and their customer data without having to manage that customer data on our platform. And so we've integrated, for example, with CRMs and so on, to allow them in real time to get that information in the same place in front of an analyst, for example. So that helps at the level after, if you will, sort of, it can be done pre-auth, actually, in some cases, but the point is, we don't believe that just the behavior will satisfy. And I think what we're after is an experience where the customer's data is treated anonymously, tokenized, so that we can have that data inform the behavioral results and vice versa. And that has been successful for us with a number of POCs and one large commercial. All of this, what I call the authentocracy, has been built on a sort of siloed, almost monopolistic behavior on the part of our friends, the card schemes, to have both the money of the interchange, the money of the flow through, and the money of the authentication process. And I think one of the good things that's happening with behavior and with other things is people saying, well, shouldn't we do this a different way? Completely different to the way it's been done in the past, basically based on databases of personally identifiable information. And I think that's where the market will end up going.
I'm delighted that all these different ranges of viewpoints can come forward. We haven't solved the world today. We're never going to. But all I can say is that we've got a whole bunch of people here that are prepared to be vocal, that have got great solutions in their own right, and that we can work together. And I think that's the working together bit that's really first and foremost in my mind. So thank you for joining us.